Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight, we begin with How was partying in Victorian London? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. How was partying in Victorian London? The season's curfew, when the gaslight ignites the night. To the modern American eye, the concept of a party involves a release of tension, a loosening of the tie, a kicking off of shoes. But in Victorian London, particularly during the height of the season, a party was a high-performance machine. As the sun dipped below the jagged, chimney-potted horizon of the Thames, the city underwent a mechanical and chemical metamorphosis. This was the season's curfew, the moment when the industrial labour of the British Empire paused just long enough for the social labour of the aristocracy to begin. It was not a time of rest, it was a transition from the economy of coal to the economy of manners. The atmospheric shift, from soot to sulphur. By 6 p.m., the London particular, that infamous yellowish pea souper, fog would begin to thicken. This wasn't just weather, it was a byproduct of 1 million coal fires. For the partygoer, the fog was the first guest. It clung to the wool of overcoats and the silk of top hats, carrying the scent of the river, the stables, and the nearby factories. But as the carriages turned toward Mayfair, the smell changed. The damp, earthy scent of the street was replaced by the sharp, slightly sulphuric hiss of the gas lamps. The curfew was marked by the appearance of the lamplighter. This figure was the herald of the night's revelry. As he moved down the avenues with his long pole, igniting the jets, he was effectively charging the city's battery. For an American visitor of the era, the sight was breathtaking. While New York was still largely a city of shadows, London was becoming a grid of fire. The gaslight didn't just illuminate the street, it created a visual hierarchy. The brighter the street, the more expensive the neighborhood. To enter the West End at night was to step into a luminous canyon, where the grime of the East End was bleached out by the steady greenish-white glow of the burners. The physics of the artificial day. Inside the great mansions of Belgrave Square, the curfew triggered a domestic revolution. The Victorians were obsessed with the conquest of the dark. To host a party was to demonstrate one's power over the elements. This was achieved through the architecture of the interior. As the natural light faded, the butler's hierarchy swung into action. Every window was shuttered and draped with 3 layers of fabric, a sheer lace, a heavy silk, and a final blackout layer of velvet. This served a thermodynamic and social purpose. By sealing the windows, the host created a closed system. The heat from the gas chandeliers, which could reach temperatures that would make a modern room feel like a sauna, was trapped inside. This forced summer allowed women to wear sleeveless, low-cut gowns made of gossamer silks even in the dead of a damp London spring. The party was a rebellion against the English climate. The carriage clog, the logistics of the midnight rush. If the interior was a controlled paradise, the street was a mechanical nightmare. By 9 p.m., the social arteries of London, Piccadilly, Pall Mall, and St. James's Street, became the site of the world's first high-stakes traffic jams. For the American reader, envision the chaos of a modern New York City gridlock, but replace the honking horns with the cacophony of the stable. The sound was a deafening percussion of progress. The iron-rimmed wheels of thousands of broughams and hansoms grinding against the granite sets. The rhythmic clack-thud of hooves and the shouting of coachmen. This was the social sieve.
To even arrive at a party was a test of endurance. A carriage might sit for 45 minutes in a line of vanity just to move 3 blocks. Inside these carriages, the pre-party was a silent, tense affair. This was the mobile dressing room. In the cramped, dark interior, women sat perfectly upright, their corsets making it impossible to lean back, while men checked their white tie precision in small flickering hand mirrors. The carriage was a transition pod, a tiny moving piece of private property that ferried the elite through the public filth of the city towards the sanctified light of the ballroom. The acoustic horizon of Mayfair. As the carriage finally neared the destination, the soundscape shifted. The raw roar of the main thoroughfares gave way to the muffled elegance of the side streets. Many hosts would pay the city to lay down a thick layer of straw or tan bark on the cobblestones in front of their house. This was the acoustic curfew. It silenced the approach of the carriages, creating a sonic buffer that signaled the transition from the world of work to the world of play. The only sounds allowed to penetrate this zone were the snapping of carriage doors, the rustle of silk, and the distant rhythmic thrum of the orchestra leaking through the masonry. This was soundscape engineering. The Victorians knew that true luxury was the absence of the city's industrial noise.
The threshold, the biological exchange. The climax of the season's curfew was the moment of the threshold crossing. As the heavy oak doors of a mansion swung open, a plume of heat and perfume would rush out into the cold London night. This was the biological exchange. The cold, damp traveller was suddenly hit by a wave of sensation, the smell of expensive beeswax, the heavy floral scent of thousands of hothouse lilies, and the ozone scent of the gaslights. For that American traveller, this was the sensory hook. You weren't just entering a house, you were entering a living organism. The house was breathing through its guests. The curfew had done its job. It had separated the night into 2 distinct histories, the outer history of the cold, dark industrial empire, and the inner history of the golden, heated, and frantic pursuit of social dominance. The party was now live, and the Gaslight Symphony had begun its first movement. The architecture of the invitation, cards, crests, and social currency. In the high-velocity world of Victorian London, a party did not begin when the music started. It began weeks, sometimes months earlier, with the arrival of a small, stiff rectangle of pasteboard. For the American reader, accustomed to the more fluid, democratic, come-as-you-are spirit of the frontier or the boisterous mixers of the Midwest, the Victorian invitation was something else entirely. It was a sartorial passport. It was a document of admission into a geographical sanctuary. To understand the Victorian party is to understand that the architecture of the invitation was the first line of defense for an aristocracy that felt the industrial world closing in on them. The physics of the pasteboard. The invitation was a masterpiece of tactile engineering. In an age before digital communication, the weight of the paper was the first social signal. A royal or high society invitation was never printed on common paper. It was Bristol board, a multi-ply, heavy-gauge cardstock that felt like a thin sheet of ivory in the hand. The text was rarely just written, it was engraved. The process involved a master craftsman carving the host's details into a copper plate, which was then inked and pressed into the card. This created a raised texture, a topographic map of status that the recipient could feel with their fingertips. When an American socialite in London received such a card, the physicality of the invitation communicated the financial density of the host. If the card was too thin, the party was suspect. If the engraving was sloppy, the host was new money. The invitation was a biological probe, sent out to test the sensitivity of the social circle.
The calling card ritual, the mechanical filter of Victorian society. Every afternoon between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m, the streets of Mayfair were filled with carriages performing the drop. A lady or gentleman would not simply visit a house, they would have their footman present a calling card to the host's butler. The butler would receive the card on a silver salver, never with his bare hands, as the mineral purity of the silver acted as a barrier between the classes. These cards were then placed in a decorative bowl in the foyer. This bowl was a social ledger. When the mistress of the house returned, she would audit the bowl. The architecture of the invitation was built upon this ledger. If your card was at the bottom of the bowl, or if your corner was folded, a complex code indicating you had left the card in person, you were being weighted. Only those whose cards survived the audit would receive the coveted Bristol board for the upcoming ball. For the Victorian elite, the party was a closed loop, and the calling card was the encryption key. The at-home card, the language of the schedule. The most common form of invitation was the at-home card. It was deceptively simple. Mrs. Beaumont at home, Thursday, May 14th, 9 o'clock. To the uninitiated American, this sounds like a casual suggestion. In London, it was a command performance. The at-home card functioned as a temporal gasket. It signaled that for a specific window of time, the public reality of the house would be suspended and it would become a social vacuum to be filled by the invited. The card often included a coded subtext in the bottom corner. Dancing indicated a full-scale ball with an orchestra. Music indicated a more refined soirée with a professional singer. Small and early, a polite lie, usually meaning the party would be massive and go until 4 a.m.
This coded language allowed the Victorian elite to sync their calendars. During the season, a single person might receive 5 at-home cards for the same night. The architecture of the invitation allowed them to map their trajectory through the city, moving from one at-home to another in a sartorial relay race. The crest as a visual seal of authenticity. The crowning achievement of the invitation was the heraldic crest. Usually embossed at the top of the card in gold or silver, the crest was the brand identity of the family. For the American observer, the crest was a link to the deep past. It was mineral history rendered in ink. It told the recipient that the party they were about to attend was not just a gathering of people, but a continuity of bloodline. The crest functioned as a seal of authenticity. In a city like London, which was rapidly filling with wealthy commoners and industrial barons, the crest was the final latch that the old aristocracy used to keep the nouveau riche at bay. If the invitation lacked a crest, it lacked gravity. The regret and the acceptance, the social contract. The final stage of the architecture was the response. In the Victorian era, to RSVP was not a suggestion, it was a legal requirement of the elite. To neglect a regret, to fail to inform a host that you weren't coming, was a social felony. It was viewed as a thermal leak in the host's planning. The host needed to know the exact human density of the ballroom to calibrate the catering and the gaslight. When a guest sent their acceptance, they were signing a social contract. They were promising to contribute their biological radiance to the host's event. The invitation was the blueprint, and the guest's acceptance was the building material. The grand promenade, the logistics of vanity, and the theatre of arrival. If the invitation was the blueprint, then the grand promenade was the groundbreaking ceremony. In the Victorian mind, a party did not begin at the top of the stairs. It began the moment the carriage door slammed shut at the guest's own residence. For the American reader, who might think of a commute as a mundane necessity, the journey to a London ball was a performative transit.
It was a 3-mile-long theatre production involving thousands of horses, hundreds of liveried servants, and a mechanical choreography so complex it required the intervention of the Metropolitan Police. This was the logistics of vanity, a system designed to ensure that the wealth of the host and the status of the guest were broadcast to the entire city before a single foot touched the threshold. The physics of the rolling jewel box. The primary vehicle of the promenade was the brougham or hansom cab, but for the truly elite it was the state chariot. These were not merely modes of transport, they were mobile vitrines. The physics of these carriages was a masterpiece of kinetic luxury. The C-spring suspension was engineered to turn the jarring percussion of the London cobblestones into a gentle sway. For a lady dressed in 40 pounds of silk and lace, this was not about comfort, it was about sartorial preservation. If the carriage jolted too violently, the architectural integrity of her hairstyle, often involving wire frames, false hair, and real jewels, would collapse. Inside, the carriage was lined with deep-buttoned silk or Morocco leather. It was a pressurized environment of perfume and anticipation. Because the season's curfew had turned the city into a freezer of damp fog, the carriage was often heated by cannel coal foot warmers or chemical heating bricks. This ensured that the guest arrived not as a shivering victim of the English weather, but as a radiant specimen, pre-warmed and ready for the biological exchange of the ballroom. The line of vanity, the grand convergence. By 10:30 p.m., the quiet side streets of Mayfair and St. James's vanished, replaced by the Great Convergence. This was the queue of the elite, often stretching for over a mile. This queue was a social audit in real time. To be at the head of the line was a sign of punctuality, which in some circles was seen as middle-class eagerness. To be at the tail of the line at midnight was the height of arrogant fashion. As the carriages sat hub to hub, a secondary economy sprang up around them. Link boys, young boys carrying torches, would weave between the horses, offering to light the way or run messages. Flower girls would thrust nosegays of violets and primroses through the windows, desperate to sell their scented wares to the bored aristocrats trapped in their rolling jewel boxes.
For the American traveller, this was the democratic spectacle of the night. The sidewalk was crowded with gawkers, the working-class Londoners who had stayed up specifically to watch the promenade. This was the only time the two Londons met face to face. The soot-stained labourer stood inches away from the diamond-dusted Duchess, separated only by a thin pane of glass and a socio-economic chasm that felt wider than the Atlantic. The liveried guard, the human component of the machine. The logistics of vanity relied heavily on the footman. On the back of every state carriage stood two grooms or footmen, dressed in plush breeches, silk stockings, and powdered wigs. These men were the living ornaments of the arrival. Their job was not just to open doors, but to project the gravity of the family. They were chosen for their height and symmetrical features, a form of biological branding. When the carriage finally reached the acoustic buffer, the straw-covered street in front of the mansion, the footman would perform a mechanical dismount while the carriage was still in motion. This cinematic flourish was the signal to the house's butler that a person of consequence had arrived. The sovereign unfolding, the exit strategy. The moment of the arrival was the climax of the promenade. The carriage would pull up to the carriage porch or porte cochere. This was a thermal transition zone, a stone canopy that allowed the guest to exit the carriage without being touched by the London particular, the fog. The unfolding was a choreographed ritual. The halt. The coachman brought the horses to a dead stop with a precision that would shame a modern chauffeur.
The deployment. The footman snapped open the carriage steps, a series of folding brass and leather stairs that cascaded down to the curb. The emergence. The lady would emerge first. This was the great reveal. Because the architecture of the invitation had promised a specific sartorial standard, her entrance was a verification of the contract. The guest didn't just walk, they exuded. The sheer volume of the skirts meant that the unfolding took time. It was a slow-motion explosion of tulle, satin, and lace. This was the promenade's final movement, the transition from the mechanical motion of the street to the statuesque elegance of the entrance hall. The coachman's vigil, the hidden side of the night. While the radiant specimens vanished into the gilded sanctuary, the logistics of vanity continued in the shadows. The carriages did not simply disappear, they moved to the mews, the service alleys behind the great houses. This was the engine room of the party. While the lords and ladies waltzed, thousands of coachmen and footmen sat in the cold, damp dark, tending to the biological engines, the horses. They frequented mews pubs, tiny hidden drinking dens where they traded the gossamer secrets of the families they served. This was the shadow promenade, a parallel party of stable fumes and gin that mirrored the champagne and perfume party inside. The logistics never stopped. The promenade was a double-sided tapestry where the beauty of the front was held up by the invisible labor of the back. The return, the inverted promenade. As the dawn approached, the promenade would reverse. The hansom cabs would be summoned by a whistle system, one whistle for a four-wheeler, two for a hansom. The acoustic horizon would shatter as the horses were brought back to the front. The guests, now thermally depleted and sensationally exhausted, would perform a reverse unfolding. The gilded symmetry of the arrival was gone, replaced by the melancholy of the morning after. The carriage would pull away, merging back into the sooty grey of the London morning, carrying its cargo of spent radiance back to the great stasis of the domestic world. The grand promenade was the living thread that stitched the private sanctuary to the public empire, proving that in Victorian London, the journey was not just a means to an end, it was the very pulse of the night. The morning of the ball, the invitation's final act. On the morning of the party, the invitation performed its final duty. It was placed on the dressing table or the mantelpiece as a visual anchor. It reminded the guest of the rank and file they were about to join. As the season's curfew approached, the invitation was often tucked into the glove of the lady or the vest of the gentleman. It was the physical proof that they belonged inside the gilded sanctuary. Without that Bristol board, they were just another ghost in the London fog. The architecture of the invitation, Chapter 2, had placed everyone in a specific social rank. Their clothing had to act as a visual anchor for that rank. To dress for a ball in London was to engage in a process of vascular and skeletal manipulation. This was the physics of the hourglass, a system of dress that turned the human form into a series of levers and fulcrums designed to catch the gaslight and hold the social gaze. The engineering of the hourglass, the corset as the chassis. For a woman, the foundation of the night was the corset. To call it underwear is a mechanical understatement. It was a structural chassis, made of coutil, a non-stretch cotton twill, and reinforced by baleen or whalebone and spring steel stays. The corset was the engine room of the female silhouette. The physics of the corset involved displacement and compression. By tightening the laces, a task that required the mechanical leverage of a lady's maid, the natural waist was compressed, often by 3 to 5 inches. This displaced the internal organs and the soft tissue of the torso, forcing it upward to create the full bosom and downward to emphasize the hips. For the American traveler, the visual result was the S-curve or the wasp waist, but the sartorial cost was high. The corset reduced the vital capacity of the lungs by approximately 20%. This meant that the atmospheric pressure of the crowded ballroom felt even more suffocating. This is why fainting couches were a literal architectural necessity. When a woman's heart rate rose during a waltz, her restricted airway couldn't keep up, leading to a thermal and respiratory collapse. The corset was a fixed constraint that dictated exactly how much biological energy a woman could expend in a single night. The bustle, the architecture of the rear. While the corset managed the core, the bustle managed the perspective. By the late Victorian era, the crinoline, the giant hoop skirt, had evolved into the bustle, a wire cage or horsehair pad worn at the small of the back. The bustle was a masterpiece of volume management. It allowed a woman to carry yards of heavy velvet and silk behind her without it dragging or interfering with her feet. This created a visual shelf that changed the aerodynamics of the walk. A woman in a bustle did not step, she glided. The bustle acted as a counterweight to the forward-leaning posture forced by the corset. Together, they created a tension-based balance that made the wearer appear as though she were a moving statue. For the American reader, imagine a world where your clothes didn't follow your body, but your body was forced to follow the preset geometry of the wire and bone. The cutaway, the white tie, and the uniform of the gentleman. While the women were architectural, the men were geometric. By the 1880s, the uniform of the midnight elite for men had stabilized into the white tie and tails. The cutaway coat was the mechanical counterpart to the corset. It was designed to be worn open, with the front cut away to reveal the stiffened piqué waistcoat and the starched shirt front. This shirt front, often referred to as a dicky, was treated with so much rice starch that it became a rigid plate of cellulose. It functioned as a shield of propriety. It could not wrinkle and it could not bend. If a man sat down incorrectly, the shirt front would pop with an audible mechanical failure. The white tie itself, a bow tie made of fine linen, had to be hand-tied with mathematical precision. For the Victorian man, the party was a test of motionless excellence. To maintain the crisp geometry of his suit while navigating the carriage clog was a sign of physical control. He was a black and white column, a visual contrast to the floral riot of the women's gowns. The sartorial armor and the biological buffer. The materials used in these uniforms were chosen for their thermal reflectivity. Silk and satin. These fabrics pinged the gaslight, reflecting the greenish-white glow of the burners and making the wearer appear to glow from within. Heavy wool, for men, acted as an insulating buffer against the London particular, the fog, during the Grand Promenade. However, once inside the closed system of the ballroom, these materials became heat traps. A Victorian party was a high internal energy environment. The combination of vascular compression from the corsets and the insulating density of the wool suits meant that the guests were constantly on the edge of overheating. This is why the scent of the night was always a mix of expensive perfume and suppressed perspiration. The sartorial armor was a biohazard that the elite wore willingly in exchange for social dominance. The glove and the fan, handheld technologies of the night. No uniform was complete without the glove and the fan. These were the secondary mechanical tools of the party. The kid leather glove. These were worn so tight they were like a second skin. They prevented biological contact. In the Victorian mind, the mineral purity of the social ritual required that no two hands ever truly touch. The glove was a bacteriological and social shield. The fan, this was the mobile cooling unit, but it was also a signaling device. The language of the fan, a series of coded gestures, allowed a woman to communicate over the acoustic horizon of the orchestra without speaking a word. The de-dressing ritual, the midnight decompression. The white tie itself, a bow tie made of fine linen, had to be hand-tied with mathematical precision. For the Victorian man, the party was a test of motionless excellence. To maintain the crisp geometry of his suit while navigating the carriage clog was a sign of physical control. He was a black and white column, a visual contrast to the floral riot of the women's gowns. The sartorial armor and the biological buffer. The materials used in these uniforms were chosen for their thermal reflectivity. Silk and satin. These fabrics pinged the gaslight, reflecting the greenish-white glow of the burners and making the wearer appear to glow from within. Heavy wool, for men, acted as an insulating buffer against the London particular, the fog, during the Grand Promenade. However, once inside the closed system of the ballroom, these materials became heat traps. A Victorian party was a high internal energy environment. The combination of vascular compression from the corsets and the insulating density of the wool suits meant that the guests were constantly on the edge of overheating. This is why the scent of the night was always a mix of expensive perfume and suppressed perspiration. The sartorial armor was a biohazard that the elite wore willingly in exchange for social dominance. The glove and the fan, handheld technologies of the night. No uniform was complete without the glove and the fan. These were the secondary mechanical tools of the party. The kid leather glove. These were worn so tight they were like a second skin. They prevented biological contact. In the Victorian mind, the mineral purity of the social ritual required that no two hands ever truly touch. The glove was a bacteriological and social shield. The fan, this was the mobile cooling unit, but it was also a signaling device. The language of the fan, a series of coded gestures, allowed a woman to communicate over the acoustic horizon of the orchestra without speaking a word. The de-dressing ritual, the midnight decompression. The final act of corsets and cutaways occurred long after the party ended. The de-dressing was a mechanical disassembly that could take an hour. As the stays were unlaced and the starched plates were removed, the body underwent a vascular re-expansion. Waltz and whispers, the ballroom as a political chessboard. Here, the atmospheric pressure of the gaslight met the biological radiance of the guests in a choreographed ritual of rotational momentum. Every movement was governed by a set of universal laws that ensured no one stepped out of line, either literally or socially. The physics of the waltz, the centrifugal engine. The waltz was the controversial nuclear reactor of the 19th century party. Unlike the quadrilles, group dances that were essentially geometric walks, the waltz required a closed hold. This was the only time in Victorian life where a man and a woman who were not married could be in continuous physical contact in a public space. The mechanics of the waltz relied on centrifugal force. Because of the bustle and the corset, the woman's center of gravity was shifted. The man acted as the fixed axis, and together they created a rotating unit. A skilled couple didn't just move across the floor, they orbited the room. This speed was essential because it created a sonic envelope. The wind generated by the fast rotation, combined with the acoustic horizon of the orchestra, allowed for the whisper. In the middle of a fast waltz, a couple could exchange forbidden intelligence or marital proposals that would be impossible to hear from the sidelines. The dance was a privacy shield powered by motion. The dance card, the social ledger of risk. If the waltz was the engine, the dance card, or carnet de bal, was a small decorative booklet, often made of ivory or silver-edged paper, attached to a lady's wrist by a silk cord. The dance card was a marketplace of access. A man would approach a lady and petition for a specific dance, the second waltz, the fourth polka. For an American visitor, this social accounting felt rigid, but for the London elite, it was a risk management system. The blank space, a lady with an empty dance card, was a social vacuum, a sign of failing market value. The full ledger, a sign of sovereign dominance.
The scandalous repeat. Dancing more than 2 dances with the same man was a vascular breach of etiquette. It signaled an official attachment, often causing the social press to begin sharpening their quills by morning. The dance card was the hardware that ensured the architecture of the invitation was carried out. It prevented random interaction, ensuring that every collision on the dance floor was pre-approved and engraved in graphite. The wallflower and the chaperone, the orbital observers. The ballroom chessboard was not just composed of the players on the floor, but the observers at the perimeter. Along the walls sat the dowagers and chaperones, the high priestesses of the stasis. These women acted as the thermal sensors of the room. They weren't there for the music, they were there to monitor the biological conduct of the youth. They watched for excessive perspiration, a sign of moral looseness, unsanctioned whispers, or lapses in symmetry. For the wallflower, the girl whose dance card remained empty, the perimeter was a place of sartorial stagnation. She had to maintain the gilded symmetry of her posture while her social potential withered. The ballroom was a zero-sum game. For every radiant success in the center of the room, there was a mineral silence at the edge. The acoustic strategy of the orchestra. The music was the clock speed of the party. The orchestra, usually hidden behind a floral screen of palms and ferns, didn't just play tunes, they regulated the environment. The tempo of the music was used to manage the crowd density. A fast galop would clear the floor of the elderly and the less mechanically gifted, leaving the space for the high-energy elite. A slow waltz would bring everyone back together. The orchestra leader was the systems administrator of the night, using sound to filter and sort the guests into their proper social stratification. The supper break, the midpoint reset. At midnight, the waltz was interrupted by the grand march to supper. This was a physical migration from the ballroom to the dining room. This served as a thermal reset. The vascular compression of the dancing was halted, allowing the guests' heart rates to drop and their sartorial armor to settle. It was a social intermission where the whispers of the dance floor were validated or debunked over plates of aspic and glasses of champagne. The chessboard was momentarily paused, but the war of manners continued in the architecture of the buffet. The legacy of the symmetric spin. As the night progressed towards the dawn of the hansom, the ballroom became a blur of spent energy. The polished floor, often treated with French chalk to make it low friction, was now scuffed and mineralized by thousands of footsteps. The waltz and whispers had done their job. The social ledger of the season had been updated. The dance card was a physical archive of the night's victories and defeats. For the Victorian elite, the ballroom was not a place of fun. It was a biological and political arena where the great history of their class was preserved through the perfect geometry of a 3/4 time signature. This was the true curfew, the moment the architectural self was put away in a cedar chest and the biological self was allowed to breathe again.
The Victorian party was a feat of engineering that proved that style was not just a choice, but a skeletal commitment. By turning the body into a symmetrical machine, the London elite ensured that the great stasis of the night was always a polished and orderly affair. The supper room, oysters, aspic, and champagne fountains. By midnight, the biological radiance of the ballroom had reached a fever pitch. The waltz and whispers had depleted the guests' glucose levels, and the thermal pressure of the gaslight had created a collective thirst. The opening of the supper room doors was the secondary threshold of the night. It was a transition from the kinetic art of dance to the static art of the table. The physics of the cold buffet. Unlike a modern dinner party, a Victorian ball supper was almost exclusively cold. This was a logistical necessity. In a house hosting 200 to 500 guests, the kitchen engine could not produce hundreds of hot steaks simultaneously. Instead, the meal relied on structural gastronomy.
The centerpiece of the table was the aspic. In an era before industrial refrigeration, savory jellies made from clarified meat stock were a thorough technology. They held their shape in the sweltering heat of a gaslit room, acting as a preservative shell for lobster, quail eggs, or poached salmon. To the Victorian eye, the translucency of the aspic was a sign of mineral purity. A guest didn't just eat, they observed the food through a gelatinous lens. This was food as architecture. The table was a miniature city of jelly towers and pastry fortifications, designed to be admired as much as consumed. For the guest, the challenge was to navigate these gelatinous obstacles while maintaining the gilded symmetry of their posture. The oyster economy, the fuel of the elite. If aspic was the architecture, then the oyster was the currency. In 1880s London, oysters were the ultimate fast fuel. They required no chewing, a vital advantage for a woman whose vascular compression made deep breaths difficult, and they provided an immediate mineral boost of zinc and salt. The logistics of the oyster were staggering. A single grand ball might consume 5,000 to 10,000 oysters, shucked in real time by an army of hidden laborers in the scullery. For the American visitor, who might recognize the oyster from the coastal oyster bars of New York City, the London presentation was a refined slaughter. They were served on ice plinths, maintaining a thermal contrast to the humid air of the room. The oyster was the perfect party food, high-density energy that left no sartorial evidence on the white kid leather gloves. The champagne fountain, the chemical lubricant. No Victorian party could function without the flow of France. Champagne was the chemical engine of the night. It served two purposes, thermal cooling and social lubrication. The champagne was served in coupe glasses, wide, shallow bowls that were rumored to be modeled after the breast of Marie Antoinette. The physics of the coupe allowed the carbonation to escape quickly, meaning the wine went flat but remained cold. This allowed guests to drink large quantities rapidly without the gas buildup that would be disastrous for a tightly corseted torso. The champagne fountain, a cascading tower of glasses, was a visual metaphor of the host's liquid wealth. In a city where the water was often a biological hazard, the mineral purity of the champagne was the only safe hydration strategy. The pineapple paradox, imperialism on a plate. To an American in the 21st century, the pineapple is a common fruit. To a Victorian in 1880, it was a household miracle. Growing a pineapple in the English climate required a coal-fired greenhouse and constant labor. To display a pineapple at a midnight supper was to say, "I have conquered the seasons." Often the pineapple was so expensive that it was not even eaten. It was rented from a greengrocer for the night to act as a visual anchor of status. It was the mineral ghost of the tropics sitting in the middle of a London particular, the fog, proving that the British Empire could order the sun to shine in the dark. The supper room scramble, the social filter.
Despite the elegance, the supper room was a site of controlled chaos. Because there were never enough chairs for everyone, the supper room scramble was a test of chivalrous logistics. A gentleman's worth was measured by his ability to forage for his partner. He had to navigate the congestion of the buffet, balance a plate of weaponized aspic and a coupe of champagne, and return to his lady without a sartorial breach. For the American observer, it looked like a polite riot. The room was a filter. Those who could not secure a perch to eat were forced to remain in a state of nutritional deficit, which would inevitably lead to an early exit from the party. The sugar-induced stasis. As the supper concluded, the chemical composition of the party shifted. The high glucose impact of the jellies and the alcoholic surge of the champagne created a secondary bloom of energy. The spent radiance of the ballroom was temporarily recharged. The guests would move from the supper room to the retiring rooms, carrying the lingering scent of truffles and wine with them. The supper room was the metabolic heart of the Victorian night, a place where the infinite history of the empire was eaten, one oyster at a time, to ensure the gilded machine could keep turning until the dawn. Gaslight shadows, the intimacy of the retiring rooms and backroom deals. If the Victorian mansion was a biological engine, the retiring rooms, the card rooms, the smoking rooms, and the boudoirs were the cooling vents. These were the spaces designed for atmospheric decompression. In a world where every glance was audited by a chaperone, Chapter 5, the shadows provided a regulatory loophole. Here, the physics of the secret took precedence over the physics of the dance. To step out of the light was not to leave the party, it was to enter its command center. The acoustic insulation of the sanctuary. The retiring rooms were masterpieces of sonic segregation. To move from the ballroom into a side salon was to experience a sudden vacuum. Architecturally, these rooms were lined with lincrusta, an embossed leather-like wall covering, and draped with portieres, heavy double-sided velvet curtains that hung over the doors. These acted as sound baffles. They absorbed the high-frequency ribbons of the violins and the percussion of the street. For an American visitor, the silence of these rooms would feel mineral and heavy. This acoustic isolation was essential for the backroom deal. Whether it was a marital merger between a duke and an American heiress or a financial coup involving Egyptian railway bonds, the deal required a low-noise environment. The room was a safe deposit box for the spoken word. The smoking room, the masculine engine of smoke and silk. The smoking room was the carbon-rich core of the night. It was the only space where the mineral purity of the party was intentionally polluted. As the men migrated here after supper, the sartorial armor changed. Many would swap their cut-away coats for smoking jackets of heavy velvet with quilted lapels. These jackets were chemical shields. The velvet was designed to trap the odor of the cigars, preventing the smoke from clinging to the wool of their formal wear. The physics of the smoking room involved the concentration of masculine power. Under a thick canopy of blue Havana smoke, the gilded symmetry of the ballroom was replaced by slumped intimacy. Men who had been geometric columns for 4 hours now sat in deep-buttoned leather chairs, leaning in to trade whispered intelligence. For the Victorian male, the smoking room was a lobbying firm. Here, the infinite history of the empire was managed over glasses of peated scotch and heavy port. The smoke acted as a visual veil, a thermal blanket that allowed the engineers of the night to speak without being read by the ladies. The boudoir, the command center of the matriarch. While the men had the smoke, the women had the boudoir, from the French bouda to sulk. But sulking was the last thing happening here. The boudoir was the tactical map room of the party. Inside, the vascular compression of the corset was momentarily forgotten as women sat on chaise longues to repair their sartorial integrity. A lady's maid would be stationed here with a crisis kit of needles, thread, and smelling salts, but the real work was the audit of the dance card. the biological scan. Women would compare notes on the radiance of rivals, who was overheated, whose symmetry was failing. The marital reconnaissance. The boudoir was where marital engineering was finalized. If a young girl was dancing too often with a penniless younger son, the matriarchs would deploy a social intervention before the next waltz. For the American reader, the boudoir was the high society think tank. It was a female-only grid where reputational assets were traded with the cold efficiency of a Wall Street floor. The gaslight paradox, the shadow as a tool. We must return to the physics of the flame. Because Victorian gaslight was directional and harsh, it created extreme shadows. Unlike the omnidirectional glow of modern LED lighting, gas jets in a chandelier created pockets of obscurity in the corners of a room.
The Victorians used these shadows as functional spaces. A shadowed alcove behind a marble bust of a Roman emperor was not a dead zone, it was a communication hub. This was where forbidden touches, gloved hand on gloved hand, occurred. The shadow was the analog encryption of the night. If you stood in the gaslight shadow, you were effectively off the grid. This allowed for a dual reality, the golden reality of the center of the room and the amber reality of the edges. The card room, the mathematics of despair. In many parties, a separate room was dedicated to whist or baccarat. This was the mathematical shadow of the night. The card room was a place of mineral silence. Unlike the acoustic chaos of the ballroom, the only sounds here were the snap of pasteboard and the chime of gold sovereigns. For many Victorian aristocrats, whose wealth was land-rich but cash-poor, the card room was a site of total risk. The sartorial armor here was a poker face. The logistics of vanity, Chapter 3, might have brought them there in a state chariot, but a single hand of whist in the gaslight shadows could send them home in a hansom cab with their ancestral estate signed away on a napkin. The card room was the dark engine of the party, where the gilded symmetry of the family was often liquidated by dawn. The conservatory, the intersection of the biological and the mineral. The final retiring room was often the conservatory. This was a glass cage filled with exotic ferns and palms. The conservatory was the thermal buffer between the forced summer of the house and the London particular, the fog of the street. It was a liminal space. The smell was chlorophyll and damp earth, a biological contrast to the perfume and gas of the interior. In the shadows of the giant ferns, the Victorian party reached its evolutionary peak. It was a place for stolen moments that felt natural in an engineered world. As the gaslight shadows lengthened towards the morning, these retiring rooms became the archive of the night. The whispers were now decisions. The smoking room was empty, leaving only the cold ash of the cigar. The boudoir was silent, the smelling salts capped. The backroom deals had been struck. The shadows had done their work, ensuring that when the gilded machine finally stopped, the infinite history of the guests had been irrevocably altered in the dark. Beyond the velvet rope, the rise of the public pleasure garden. In the private ballrooms of Mayfair, the season's curfew was a barrier to keep the world out. But in the public pleasure gardens, the party was an expansionist empire. These gardens, sprawling acres of manicured walks, gilded pavilions, and electric altars, were the primary sites of interclass collision. Here the physics of the party changed from the rotational momentum of the waltz to the kinetic chaos of the crowd. For the Victorian Londoner, the pleasure garden was a venting valve for the industrial pressure of the city. The acoustic and visual bloom of the garden. The pleasure garden was a sensory supernova. While a private party relied on acoustic insulation, Chapter 7, the garden relied on projection.
As a guest approached by boat, often crossing the Thames from Westminster, the garden appeared as a luminous cloud on the horizon. This was the visual magnetism of the night. Unlike the greenish gaslight of the interior, the gardens were early adopters of limelight and early electric arc lamps. To an American visitor, the garden looked like a city made of frozen lightning. The architecture of the garden was designed for the gaze. The Grand Walk at Vauxhall was a quarter-mile of gravel flanked by thousands of variegated lamps, small glass jars filled with oil and a wick, coloured in ruby, emerald and sapphire. This was the low-frequency magic of the era. The light didn't just illuminate, it vibrated. This created a psychological shift in the guests. The gilded symmetry of the ballroom was replaced by a kaleidoscopic fragmentation. In the garden, you weren't a geometric column, you were a speck of light in a larger glittering machine. The class-blurring mechanism, the leveling effect of the ticket. The most radical technology of the pleasure garden was the 3-shilling ticket. Unlike the architecture of the invitation, which required bloodline and rank, the garden required only specie.
This created a social short-circuit. A shop girl, having saved her wages for a month, could dress in cheap tarlatan that mimicked the silk of a duchess and walk the same gravel path as a duke. This was the promenade of pretense. In the gaslight shadows of the dark walks, the sartorial armor became a disguise. The incognito elite. Aristocrats often came to the gardens in plain coats to escape the audit of the chaperone. The aspiring poor, the working class, wore Sunday best to mimic the elite. The result was a fluidity that terrified the Victorian moralists. The garden was a laboratory of identity where the infinite history of the individual could be rewritten for the price of a drink. For the American reader, this is the precursor to the modern nightclub culture, a space where you are who you appear to be, not who you are born as. The orchestral shell and the rotunda, the physics of public sound. The music in the garden was not a whisper, it was a broadside. The orchestral shell was a parabolic acoustic reflector made of wood and plaster, designed to project the sound of a 50-piece band across acres of land. Inside the rotunda, a massive circular building that could hold thousands, the acoustic pressure was immense. The sound was omnidirectional. In the ballroom, the music was a clock speed. In the rotunda, the music was an atmosphere. People didn't just dance, they circulated in a massive, slow-moving human whirlpool. This was the centrifugal socialization of the masses. The rotational momentum was no longer restricted to couples, but to the entire body politic of London. The pyrotechnic theatre, gunpowder as entertainment. The climax of any night at Cremorne or Vauxhall was the fireworks display. To the Victorian mind, this was the conquest of the heavens. The physics of the firework was the high-energy climax of the party. It was chemical architecture built in the sky. These weren't just simple rockets, they were set pieces, massive wooden frames rigged with quick match and flash powder to create burning pictures of the Queen, the Battle of Waterloo, or a volcano. The acoustic impact of the fireworks served a social purpose. It was a collective shock. For 5 minutes, the class blurring stopped as everyone, from the chimney sweep to the Earl, looked upwards in a state of shared awe. The mineral purity of the fire was the only thing that could momentarily freeze the kinetic chaos of the crowd. The dark walks, the architecture of misbehavior. Every pleasure garden had its dark walks, unlit paths of overgrown shrubbery and artificial grottos. These were the shadow economy of the garden. If the Grand Walk was the theatre of light, the dark walks were the theatre of the forbidden. This was where the tactical map room of the boudoir lost its power. In the dark, the glove and the fan were discarded.
This was the site of unsanctioned collisions. The logistics of vanity collapsed here, replaced by the logistics of the impulse. For the social predators of London, the dark walks were the primary hunting grounds. The aeronaut, the ultimate ascent. The high-altitude party trick of the garden was the balloon ascent. At 11 p.m., a massive silk balloon filled with coal gas, the same chemical lubricant used for the lamps, would be released from the center of the garden. For the guests watching below, the aeronaut was a human metaphor for the party itself, an escape from the sooty gravity of industrial London. The balloon was the sovereign unfolding, taken to its logical extreme. It was the vertical exit from the social order. The shattered mirror, the decline of the garden. As the night approached 2 a.m., the interclass collision often turned into mechanical failure. The 3-shilling ticket that allowed everyone in also allowed in the rowdy and the drunk. The promenade of pretense would devolve into public disorder. The architecture of the garden was fragile. By the late Victorian era, these spaces were being shut down for moral decay. The gaslight shadows had become too dark, the class blurring too extreme. But for a few decades, the pleasure garden was the electric soul of London, a place where the infinite history of the city was not just observed in a ballroom, but lived in a riot of light and smoke. It was the party beyond the velvet rope, proving that the season's curfew could be broken for the right price.
The Gin Palace, neon of the industrial underworld. The Gin Palace was a visual and chemical ambush. To walk from the damp, pitch-black alleys of the East End into a gin palace was to experience a luminous shock. While the elite used acoustic insulation to create a private world, the gin palace used aggressive brilliance to attract the public. It was the first commercial architecture designed specifically to trigger a dopamine response through light and reflection. The physics of the glare, gaslight, and mirror. The primary technology of the gin palace was the amplification of light. Because the working poor lived in cellar dwellings with little to no natural light, the gin palace offered a synthetic sun. The interiors were lined with silvered mirrors and polished brass, huge gasoliers, gas chandeliers with dozens of burners were placed specifically to reflect off these surfaces. This created a hall of mirrors effect. A single gas jet was multiplied 100 times by the glass. To the malnourished eye of a dock worker, the room appeared to be made of liquid gold. This wasn't just decoration, it was psychological engineering. The glare served to bleach out the soot of the factory and the grime of the slum. Inside the palace, everyone was radiant. The physics of the glare turned a squalid reality into a gilded fantasy for the price of a penny. The vertical party. Architecture without chairs. One of the most striking differences between the supper room and the gin palace was the absence of seating. The gin palace was a machine for throughput. The architecture of the palace was built around the mahogany counter. These counters were often curved and incredibly high, acting as a barrier of authority between the server and the customer. There were no chairs, no tables, and no retiring rooms. This was a vertical party. The stand-up cycle. Guests stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a human heat sink. The thermal density was so high that even in the dead of a London winter, the fast refuel. Without chairs, the kinetic energy of the room remained high. People drank quickly and moved on, ensuring a continuous flow of capital for the proprietor. For the American reader, this is industrialized socializing. It was a party stripped of manners and ritual, reduced to the molecular interaction between the person and the blue ruin, gin.
The chemical lubricant. The evolution of blue ruin. In the ballroom, the lubricant was champagne. In the palace, it was gin. But this was not the artisanal gin of the modern era. This was a chemical compound, often adulterated with turpentine, vitriol, sulfuric acid, and sugar. The chemistry of the gin was designed for maximum impact. The sulfuric acid provided a kick or burn that simulated the feeling of high-proof alcohol, while the sugar masked the industrial impurities. This was the fuel of the underworld. It provided a sudden spike in energy, a chemical escape from the biological fatigue of 16-hour workdays. The Gin Palace was a laboratory of despair, where the infinite history of the individual was dissolved in a glass of mother's ruin. The etched glass, the theatre of privacy in public. Despite being a public spectacle, the Gin Palace used etched and cut glass to create a fractured privacy. The windows were rarely clear. They were deeply engraved with floral patterns and heraldic shields. This served a dual purpose. The visual filter. It prevented the police and the pious on the street from seeing the biological decay inside. And the light diffusion. It broke the gaslight into a rainbow spectrum, adding to the kaleidoscopic fragmentation of the room. Inside, there were often snugs, tiny partitioned cubicles with their own gas jet. These were the retiring rooms of the poor. Here, backroom deals were struck not over Egyptian bonds, but over stolen lead and pawned silks. The etched glass was the velvet curtain of the East End, providing a sartorial shield for those who had no sartorial armor.
The cacophony of the palace, the anti-orchestra. The acoustic horizon of the Gin Palace was the opposite of the symphonic waltz. It was an industrial roar. There was no orchestra. Instead, the music was the clatter of glass, the thud of copper coins on the mahogany, and the polyglot shouting of a dozen different accents: Irish, Cockney, Yiddish, and Lascar. This was the sonic slum. The acoustic density was so high that it created a wall of sound that provided its own kind of privacy. You could scream a secret into your neighbor's ear, and the person 3 feet away would hear nothing but the mechanical hum of the palace. The penny gaff, the party's narrative appendix. Often attached to or located near the Gin Palace was the penny gaff, a makeshift theatre where the working class watched melodramas and sensation plays. This was the storytelling engine of the working class party. While the elite discussed literature and opera, the gaff provided tales of murder and hanging. It was a biological release for the suppressed rage of the industrial worker. The gaff and the palace worked in tandem. The gin provided the internal glow, and the gaff provided the external spectacle. The midnight ejection, the social curfew. Unlike the grand promenade where carriages waited in a line of vanity, the exit from the Gin Palace was a centrifugal ejection. At closing time, the luminous sanctuary was shut off, and the human heat sink was pushed back into the London particular, the fog. The transition was brutal. The chemical warmth of the gin would hit the damp chill of the Thames air, leading to a thermal shock. This is where the party ended and the reality of the Victorian night began. The infinite history of the palace was evaporated by the morning light, leaving only the cold ash of the industrial machine. The Gin Palace was the gilded cage of the poor, a mechanical illusion that proved that in London even the shadows were for sale. The midnight kitchen, the subterranean engine of the ball. The Victorian kitchen was a thermal war zone.
While the architecture of the invitation promised elegance, the physics of the kitchen demanded brute force. Located in the basement stratum of the mansion, the kitchen was the only place where the scent of the night was not lavender and gas, but burning charcoal, raw game, and human effort. This was the biological buffer that absorbed the stress of the party so the guests didn't have to. The great range, the heart of the machine. The center of this world was the cast iron range. In an 1880s Mayfair mansion, this was a multi-ton combustion engine that ran 24 hours a day. The physics of the range involved thermal layering. A single unit could have 6 different heat zones, a roaring fire for the roasting spit, a moderate oven for game pies, and a simmering plate for the weaponized aspic. The radiant heat from the range was so intense that the atmospheric pressure in the kitchen was often 10 degrees higher than the rest of the house. For the scullery maid, the season was not a time of parties, but a season of dehydration. The kitchen was a closed system where the infinite history of the menu was forged in fire. The hierarchy of the scullery, a parallel empire. The kitchen was not a chaotic mob, it was a symmetrical command structure that mirrored the social ledger upstairs. The chef de cuisine, usually a Frenchman, he was the systems administrator. He didn't cook, he directed. His sartorial armor was the white toque, a symbol of mineral purity in a world of soot. The footmen were the kinetic links between the basement and the ballroom. They had to transition from the steam of the kitchen to the cool of the hall without losing their geometric posture. The scullery maids, the lowest stratum. They were the invisible labor who spent the night at the stone sink scrubbing the evidence of the feast. Their biological radiance was sacrificed to the mineral grit of the sand and soda used to clean the copper pans. For the American observer, this was corporate logistics before corporations existed. Each person was a gear in a social mechanism, and a mechanical failure at the bottom, a dropped tray or a broken sauce, would ripple upward, shattering the gilded symmetry of the party above. The acoustic command, the bell system. How did the silent sanctuary communicate with the noisy engine? Through the mechanical intelligence of the bellboard.
In the hallway outside the kitchen sat the bell indicator. When a guest pulled a tapestry cord in the drawing room, a spring-mounted bell in the basement would vibrate. Each bell had a different acoustic signature. The dining room bell had a deep copper tone. The ladies' bedroom bell was a sharp silver ring. The servants had to decode the sound instantly. This was the analog notification system of the 19th century. The bells were a temporal command, forcing the biological energy of the staff to align with the impulsive desires of the elite. The ice house, the cold storage of status. To serve champagne and oysters in a London particular, the fog, the kitchen relied on the ice house. This was a deep, brick-lined pit in the garden where Norway ice, huge blocks of frozen fjord water, was stored under layers of straw and sawdust. The logistics of the ice were a thermal miracle. The iceman would harvest the blocks with saw-toothed tools, bringing them into the basement stratum to be crushed for the champagne buckets. This was imported cold. The ability to maintain mineral purity and sub-zero temperatures in the middle of a coal-fired city was the ultimate mechanical victory of the host. The leftover economy, the shadow feast. As the supper room cleared at 2 a.m., a secondary party began. This was the feast of the remains.
In the Victorian moral economy, the servants did not eat the same food as the masters. However, the physical reality of the party meant that expensive truffles and lobster salads often returned to the kitchen half-eaten. This created a shadow market. The butler's perk. The most expensive wines and choice cuts were audited by the butler. The pig pail. The scraps were sent to the swill man for a small fee. The midnight kitchen was a place of nutritional recycling. The infinite history of the meal didn't end at the table. It was deconstructed in the basement, fueling the biological engines that would have to clean the house by dawn. The morning after physics, the great scrub. The party didn't end when the hansom cabs pulled away. For the kitchen, the exit strategy was the great scrub. The soot and grease of a party for 500 people was a bacteriological threat. The architecture of the kitchen, with its flagstone floors and tiled walls, was designed for maximum irrigation. Buckets of boiling water and carbolic soap were used to bleach the environment back to its neutral state. By 6 a.m., the subterranean engine had to be reset, ready to produce the staid breakfast of the great stasis. The midnight kitchen proves that the gilded sanctuary was a parasitic structure. It required the high-calorie labor of the basement to maintain the low-energy elegance of the ballroom. The infinite history of London was written in the soot of the range just as much as the ink of the invitation. The morning after, sartorial decompression and the emotional hangover. The morning after was a phase shift in the Victorian household. By 8 a.m., the acoustic horizon had shifted from the ribbons of the violin to the rhythmic scrubbing of the housemaids. The atmospheric pressure of the gaslight had evaporated behind a mineral residue of soot and spent wax. For the guest, waking up was not just a biological return to consciousness, it was a re-entry into the social grid. The physics of the unlacing, biological re-expansion. The first movement of the morning after occurred in the bedroom during the ritual of de-dressing. As we explored in corsets and cutaways, the body had been under vascular compression for 8 to 10 hours. The unlacing was a mechanical release. As the spring steel stays were loosened, the soft tissue and internal organs of the torso underwent a rapid re-expansion. This often caused a syncopal episode, or fainting, or vasovagal response as the blood flow redistributed itself. For the Victorian lady, the morning after began with a physical ache, the skeletal memory of the corset. The hourglass silhouette was a temporary geometry that left behind a very real biological debt. The sartorial audit, the deconstruction of the gown. While the body recovered, the lady's maid performed the sartorial audit. A formal ball gown was a capital asset, often costing the equivalent of a servant's yearly wage. The maid would inspect the architecture of the skirt for mineral contamination, dust and gravel from the grand promenade trapped in the hem. Chemical spills of drops of weaponized aspic or champagne that could degrade the fibers of the silk. Structural failure for torn lace from a centrifugal collision on the dance floor.
The morning after was a maintenance cycle. The gilded symmetry had to be manually restored using benzene for grease stains and stiff brushes for the soot. If the gown could not be repaired, it represented a financial leak in the family's social budget. The blue devils, the chemistry of the emotional hangover. The Victorians referred to the post-party depression as the blue devils. This was a neurochemical crash caused by 3 factors: the sugar drop,
The high glucose impact of the supper room had worn off, leaving the biological engine in a state of hypoglycemic exhaustion. The gaslight toxicity, spending 6 hours in a room with hundreds of open gas flames, meant inhaling carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. The morning headache was often as much gas poisoning as it was alcoholic fermentation. The social vacuum, the high-velocity validation of the ballroom was gone, replaced by the great stasis of the breakfast room. For the wallflower, the Blue Devils were particularly acidic. The morning after was a time of numerical audit, counting the blank spaces on the dance card and calculating the reputational decay of a night where no marital merger was initiated. The breakfast room stasis, the architecture of silence. Breakfast in a post-party mansion was a low-energy zone. The acoustic command of the bells was silenced. The dining room was transformed from a theater of excess into a sanctuary of recovery. The logistics of the breakfast relied on self-service. To minimize social friction, food was placed on sideboards in silver chafing dishes. This allowed the guests to eat in mineral silence, avoiding the eye contact and linguistic labor required by a formal dinner. The menu shifted from oysters and champagne to bland comforts, kedgeree, cold toast, and strong China tea. The tea acted as a systemic flush, using caffeine and tannins to tighten the nerves and stabilize the pulse. The card index of gossip, the social ledger updates. While the guests sat in atmospheric silence, the information economy of London was whirring. The morning after was when the social ledger was officially updated. Cards would begin to arrive by midday. These were the physical metadata of the night. A card left with a turned-down corner had a specific coded meaning, a verification of attendance, or a petition for further interaction. In the retiring rooms, backroom deals had been whispered. Now, in the cold light of day, those deals were formalized in ink. The morning after was the settlement period of the social stock exchange. The servants' collapse, the inversion of energy. As the guests drifted into a drug-like doze in the afternoon, the midnight kitchen reached its physical limit. The scullery maids and footmen who had been kinetic gears for 20 hours finally hit mechanical failure. The architecture of the house now functioned as a biological battery that was drained. The gilded machine was powering down. This shared exhaustion was the only time the two Londons were truly in biological alignment. Both the Duchess in her silk sheets and the maid on her straw mattress were victims of the entropy of the night. The infinite history of the hangover. By sunset the morning after, the cycle of the season would begin to reset. The sartorial armor was being readied for the next invitation. The morning after was not an end, but a recalibration. It proved that the gilded sanctuary was a transient state, a high-energy illusion that required a low-energy reality to sustain it. For the Victorian elite, the emotional hangover was the tax they paid for their social sovereignty. The heavy gold, the physics of wealth and the metallic currencies of the night. The Victorian party was a mineralized environment. While the sartorial armor provided the structure, the jewelry provided the inertia. To dress for a ball in the 1880s was to subject the body to gravitational socializing. Wealth was measured in grams and carats, and the ability to carry the heavy gold without a biomechanical failure was the ultimate sign of sovereign endurance. The tiaras and tension, the engineering of the scalp. For a woman of the midnight elite, the most prestigious and painful element of her uniform was the tiara. This was not merely a decorative headband, it was a skeletal anchor. The physics of the tiara involved distributed load. A grand tiara made of solid silver or gold and encrusted with hundreds of diamonds could weigh between 1 and 2 pounds. Because it sat on the apex of the cranium, it required a foundation of hair. The hair was ratted and piled into a structural cushion, and the tiara was then sewn into place with silk thread. This created a fixed center of gravity. A woman wearing a tiara could not tilt her head quickly without risking a mechanical displacement. The tiara forced a rigid verticality of the spine. For the American visitor, the regal grace of the Victorian Duchess was actually a functional necessity to prevent her mineral assets from falling onto the ballroom floor. The morning after for these women often included cranial neuralgia, a literal headache caused by the downward pressure of the family fortune. The stomacher, the architecture of the torso. If the tiara was the beacon, the stomacher was the engine block. This was a massive triangular piece of jewelry that was pinned directly to the corset chassis, covering the area from the bust to the waist. The stomacher was a masterpiece of surface area management. By pinning the jewelry to the corset rather than the skin, the structural integrity of the garment absorbed the weight. A large stomacher could contain over 1,000 diamonds, acting as a shield of light. The radiance factor. In the gaslight shadows, the stomacher acted as a reflector. It caught the flickering ribbons of the lamps and bounced them back, ensuring the wearer was always the brightest object in the acoustic horizon. The tactile warning. The stomacher also served as a physical buffer. It prevented anyone from getting too close during the waltz, acting as a sharp-edged barrier to intimacy. The sovereign and the shilling, the currencies of the room. While the women carried the heavy gold on their skin, the men carried the metallic currencies in their pockets. The Victorian party was a cash-based simulation. The primary currency of the night was the sovereign, a coin made of 22-carat gold. The physics of the sovereign was its tactile certainty. Unlike the paper promises of the American dollar, the sovereign had a metallic weight that communicated infinite history. The butler's bribe. To secure a prime position in the supper room, a gentleman would palmate a sovereign into the hand of the butler. The card room stakes. In the gaslight shadows, the chime of gold was the only music. The sound of gold hitting the green baize of a card table was a sonic marker of risk. For the working poor in the midnight kitchen, the shilling, silver, was the lifeblood of the night. The gap between the gold and the silver was the class-blurring barrier that defined the city. A single gold sovereign represented the biological labor of a month for a scullery maid, yet it was liquidated in a second for a glass of vintage Flow of France. The watch chain, the geometry of time. For the gentleman, the heavy gold was concentrated in the Albert watch chain. This was a thick gold chain that spanned the stiffened piqué waistcoat. The watch chain was a horizontal anchor. It provided a visual weight to the masculine silhouette, balancing the cutaway coat. At the end of the chain sat the watch block, the clock speed regulator of the night. In the great stasis of the Victorian party, knowing the time was a form of power. To consult the gold was to signal that one's time was more valuable than the event itself. It was the metadata of status. The inherited dust, the chemistry of antique gold. A significant part of the heavy gold was antique. Victorian jewelry was often transmuted. Old family assets were broken down and re-engineered into new settings.
This created a chemical lineage. The gold worn at a ball in 1880 might contain the molecular residue of a ring worn at the court of George III. For the Victorian elite, this mineral continuity was their sartorial shield against the new money of the Industrial Revolution. The heavy gold felt warm because it had been passed through the biological heat of 5 generations. For the American dollar princesses, the heiresses, buying this gold was a way to purchase an ancestry they didn't possess. The jewel theft, the shadow economy of the mineral. The physics of wealth created its own criminal gravity. Because the heavy gold was so visible, it attracted the professional predator. The exit strategy of the party was the most dangerous moment. As guests moved from the luminous sanctuary to the London particular, the fog, they were glowing targets. The sartorial armor was vulnerable to the mechanical leverage of a street thief's hand. This is why link boys with torches were hired to create a moving perimeter of light around the mineralized guests as they reached their hansom cabs. The vault and the velvet, the final stasis. When the morning after arrived, the heavy gold underwent its own decompression. It was removed from the skeletal chassis of the body and placed into velvet-lined oak boxes. These boxes were then transported by the butler to the bank vault or the strong room. The infinite history of the night was locked away, returning to its static state as a financial reservoir. The heavy gold had done its work. It had anchored the social status of the family for another night, proving that in the Victorian world, weight was the only incontrovertible truth. The dawn of the hansom, the logistics of the exit. By 4 a.m., the atmospheric pressure of the party had dropped. The champagne fountains were dry, and the heavy gold had begun to feel like a mineral burden. The exit was not a casual stroll, it was a sequential migration managed by the link boys and the police. The link boy, the shadow workers of the night. These were the shadow workers of the night, impoverished boys who carried links, torches made of pitch and tow. The physics of the link boy involved the creation of a mobile luminous zone. In a city without consistent street lighting, the fog of 1880 was a biological and visual barrier. The link boy provided the photonic tunnel through which the sartorial armor could pass without mineral contamination from the soot-covered pavement. The thermal beacon. The torch didn't just provide light, it provided directional heat, cutting a path through the damp chill of the Thames air. The safety perimeter. By surrounding the guests with fire, the link boy created a chemical deterrent against the professional predators lurking in the gaslight shadows. The hansom cab, the gondola of London. Waiting at the curb was the hansom cab, the mechanical marvel of Victorian transport. For the American reader, think of it as the high-speed data packet of the 19th century street. The hansom was a masterpiece of dynamic equilibrium. The high axis. The driver, the jarvey, sat on a perch behind the passengers. This allowed the center of gravity to remain low, preventing the cab from tipping during a high-velocity turn. The apron. The passengers were enclosed by folding doors or a leather apron. This was the sartorial shield of the street. It protected the silk and lace from the mud splash of the horses, a biological slurry of manure and Thames water. The trapdoor. Communication with the driver happened through a small hatch in the roof. This was the acoustic interface of the journey. The elite could remain spatially segregated from the working-class driver while still directing the mechanical engine. The queue of vanity. The traffic of status. The street outside a Mayfair mansion was a low-friction logistical jam. Hundreds of carriages, brooms, victorias, and hansoms had to be sorted and filtered. This was the command and control phase of the night. The footman would stand on the portico shouting the names of the families. The Duke of Westminster's carriage became a vocal signature that echoed through the acoustic horizon. For the guest, the wait was the final social audit. To have one's carriage arrive immediately was a sign of logistical dominance. To be left standing in the entryway stratum was a reputational leak, signaling that one's mechanical assets were poorly managed. The transition of light from gas to grey. The most psychologically violent part of the exit was the colour shift. Inside, the world was amber and gold. Outside, the London dawn was a bacteriological grey. This was the visual decompression. The limelight of the ballroom had bleached the guests' retinas, making the natural light of morning appear deathly and mineral. This is why the fan and the veil were so crucial during the exit. They weren't just for flirtation, they were optical filters used to hide the biological decay, the dark circles, the pale skin, that the morning after was already beginning to impose. The soot and the satin, the molecular collision. As the hansom pulled away, the infinite history of the night met the industrial reality of the city. The satin shoes, designed for the low-friction floor of the ballroom, were never meant to touch the grit of the macadam. The exit was a sartorial sacrifice. By the time a guest reached their own front door threshold, the sartorial armor was degraded. The silk hems were hydrated by the fog, and the heavy gold was cold to the touch. The gilded machine had successfully processed the guest, turning their social potential into spent energy. The curfew of the sun. The dawn of the hansom was the hard reset of the Victorian social network. As the jarvey whipped the horse toward the residential squares, the ballroom chessboard was folded up. The logistics of the exit proved that the gilded sanctuary was a temporal island. It could only exist in the artificial summer of the gaslight. Once the clock speed of the city returned to its workday frequency, the magic of the mineral vanished. The infinite history of the night was now a memory archive locked behind the velvet-lined boxes of the bedroom. The Victorian party didn't just end, it dissolved into the fog, leaving behind nothing but the cold ash of the range and the scent of spent champagne. The social press, turning the night into public metadata. If the ballroom was the engine and the kitchen was the fuel, then the social press was the archive. In the 1880s, the printing press acted as a social hard drive. A party that was not reported was a party that, in the eyes of the empire, had never happened. This chapter explores the physics of the print, the mechanism by which whispers and waltzes were turned into ink and influence. The scribbler in the hallway, the human interface. The architecture of the press began at the front door threshold. Beside the footman stood a man in a shabby genteel coat with a notebook. This was the society reporter. The reporter was the biological censor of the night. He did not enter the gilded sanctuary, he was a peripheral device. He stood in the transition zone, the lobby, recording the names of the guests as they were announced. The audit of attendance. Every guest was a data point. The reporter's job was to filter the crowd, identifying the mineral purity of the titles versus the industrial Brit of the new money, the dollar princesses. The sartorial transcription. Reporters developed a linguistic shorthand for the sartorial armor, Chapter 4. A gown was never just green, it was eau de Nil silk with a corsage of tea roses. This was the translation of the visual into the textual. The physics of the type, the industrialization of gossip. Once the reporter had his data, he raced to Fleet Street. Here, the mechanical engine of the party met the mechanical engine of the press. The social ledger was processed through linotype machines and rotary presses. This was the high-velocity replication of the night. The inky shadow. By 4 a.m., while the dawn of the hansom was still unfolding, the infinite history of the party was already being stamped onto cheap pulp paper. The thermal contrast. The heat of the ballroom was gone, but the heat of the press was just beginning. The lead type was literally molten, casting the reputations of the guests into permanent metal. For the American reader, this is the ancestor of the social media feed. It was a batch-processed update that hit every breakfast table in London by 9 a.m. To see one's name in the Morning Post was the verification of existence. The list of names, the numerical hierarchy of status. The most powerful part of the social press was not the descriptions, but the list of names. This was a vertical ranking system. The order of the names in the newspaper was never alphabetical. It was symmetrically stratified by rank. The royals. If a prince attended, he was the header. The dukes, duchesses, the structural load-bearers of the list. The etceteras, the names at the bottom. To be an etc. was to be socially invisible, a rounding error in the social ledger. For a young debutante, the morning after was a mathematics class. She would audit her position on the list. Did she appear before her rival? Was she mentioned in the same data packet as an eligible bachelor? The press was the social scoreboard that determined the gravitational pull of her family. The language of the subtext, the code of the columnist. Because of the season's curfew on public scandal, the reporters used a coded vocabulary. This was the acoustic encryption of the printed word. Much admired, this was the high performance rating for a woman's sartorial armor. Animated conversation, a subsurface hint that a marital merger was in progress. Left early, a biological warning of social failure or reputational decay. The social press didn't just report facts, it provided the metadata of interpretation. The reader had to decode the ink to understand what had truly happened in the gaslight shadows. For the dollar princesses, a positive subtext in the London press was the ROI, return on investment, for the heavy gold they had spent to get there. The global reach, the telegraphic extension. By 1880, the social ledger was no longer confined to London. Through the Atlantic cable, the infinite history of a London ball was telegraphed to New York and Newport. This was the electronic diffusion of the party. A marital merger between a British earl and an American heiress was broadcast across the ocean in real time. The acoustic horizon of the party was now transatlantic. This created a feedback loop. The American press would report on the London party, which increased the market value of the heiresses, which led to more invitations. The press was the global lubricant of the Victorian social machine. The clipping bureau, the physical archive of vanity. For the Victorian elite, the social press was a capital asset to be harvested. Families employed clipping bureaus to cut out every mention of their names and paste them into scrapbooks. These books were the biological and social resume of the family. They were the permanent record of their sovereign unfolding. The mineral hardness of fact. A memory of a waltz might fade, but a clipped column was physical proof of status. The legacy engine. These scrapbooks were passed down through generations, ensuring that the gilded sanctuary was never forgotten. They were the infinite history made tangible. The price of the ink, the shadow economy of reporting. The social press was not an objective mirror. It was part of the shadow economy. Publicists, though they didn't call themselves that yet, would incentivize reporters with champagne and bribes to ensure a favorable placement. The inky radiance of the morning could be bought with the heavy gold of the night. This was the final corruption of the party. The gilded symmetry of the ballroom was often a manufactured illusion created by the mechanical power of the press. The sunlight of reality.
As the morning after turned into the afternoon of the paper, the social press completed the systemic reset. The private night was now public history. The sartorial armor was in the maintenance cycle, the heavy gold was in the vault, and the names were in the ink. The social press proves that the Victorian Party was not a transient event, but a data generation exercise. It was a way for the empire to index its assets and audit its allegiances. In London, the infinite history of the night was only as good as the quality of the print the next morning.
The Grand Exodus, the mothballing of the gilded machine. The transition from the high-energy state of the London season to the stasis of the country was a phase shift that affected every stratum of the city. By the first week of August, the acoustic horizon of Mayfair shifted from the rhythmic gallop of the hansom to the clatter of hammers as shutters were bolted over the windows of the great squares. The physics of the grand shutdown. The closing of a London house was an act of sartorial and architectural preservation. Once the family departed for their estates in the north or the mineral spas of the continent, the house entered a state of hibernation. The dust sheet stratum. Every piece of gilded furniture and every crystal chandelier was covered in heavy linen holland covers. This created a spectral interior, a world of white contours where the visual magnetism of the wealth was neutralized to prevent sun bleaching and soot infiltration. The druggeting of the floors. The low-friction dance floors were covered with drugget, a coarse wool fabric designed to protect the polished parquetry from the maintenance scratches of the skeletal staff left behind. The newspaper barrier. In the gaslight shadows of the library, the mirrors and paintings were often covered with old copies of the Morning Post. This was the final irony of the press. The same metadata of the morning that had built the family's reputation, as discussed in the social press section, was now used as a physical filter to keep the dust off their ancestors' portraits. The logistics of the heavy freight. The move to the country was a high mass migration. The infinite history of the family had to be physically translated from the city to the estate. This required the mechanical power of the Great Western or London and North Western railways. The heavy gold and sartorial armor were packed into iron-bound trunks and leather portmanteaus. For a single family, this could involve 50 or 60 pieces of luggage. The silver safe transfer. The family plate, the mineral wealth used for the dinner parties, was packed into green baize-lined chests and sent under armed escort to the bank or the country stronghold. The servant migration. The subterranean engine of the kitchen, the midnight kitchen, was dismantled. The staff was divided. A skeletal crew remained to guard the London hollow shell, while the primary kinetic staff, the butler, the valets, the ladies' maids, travelled in third-class carriages to prepare the country house for the family's arrival. The railway threshold, the new acoustic command. The railway terminus, Euston, Paddington, or St. Pancras, became the primary social interface during the Exodus. The acoustic command of the bells was replaced by the steam whistle and the iron clatter. The station was a compression chamber of class. On the platform, the sovereign unfolding of a duchess met the industrial reality of the steam engine. The hansom cab, the gondola of London, delivered the guests to the first-class carriage, a mobile sanctuary that attempted to replicate the gilded symmetry of the drawing room within a moving wooden box. The physics of the journey involved linear speed replacing rotational momentum. The waltz was over. The long-distance pulse of the train now dictated the biological rhythm of the elite. The mothball chemistry, the preservation of the wardrobe. Inside the storage stratum of the London house, the sartorial armour underwent chemical defence. Because the London particular, the fog, and the industrial soot were biological and mineral corrosives, the clothes had to be immunised. The use of camphor and naphthalene, mothballs, created a chemical atmosphere in the cedar closets. This sharp medicinal scent was the acoustic signature of the off-season. The silk and lace that had absorbed the fleur of France and the scent of lavender were now saturated with the smell of preservation. To walk through a mothballed mansion was to inhale the scent of social stasis. The empty squares, the social vacuum. By mid-August, the social ledger of London was zeroed out. The acoustic horizon of the West End became mineral and silent. The absence of the elite created a power vacuum in the city's service economy. The ghost trade. The high-end grocers of Piccadilly and the dressmakers of Bond Street entered their own maintenance cycle. Without the high glucose impact of the supper room and the constant friction of the sartorial audit, the economic engine of London slowed to a crawl. The caretaker's reign. The city was left to the caretakers and the working millions. For a few months, the architecture of the night was no longer a theatre of the elite. The gin palaces continued to roar, but the gilded sanctuaries remained dark, black holes in the luminous cloud of the city. The country house as the new operating system. The exodus was not an end to the party, but a re-platforming. The infinite history of the season was transferred to the country house weekend. In the country, the physics of the party changed. The rigid verticality of the London mansion was replaced by the horizontal expansion of the estate. The sartorial armour became sporting tweeds and walking silks. The logistics of vanity shifted from the ballroom to the shooting party and the garden fete. However, the social ledger remained the same. The metadata gathered during the London season, the marital mergers and backroom deals, was now beta-tested in the privacy of the countryside. The permanent record of the shutdown. As the last hansom disappeared into the summer fog, the social press, as we've seen, published the final list. These were the departures. The Earl and Countess of X have left for their seat in Derbyshire. This was the closing bracket of the infinite history of the year. The gilded machine was logged off. The symmetry was broken, the energy was dissipated, and the mineral purity of the London season was stored in the archive. The exodus proved that the London party was a cyclical phenomenon, a high-energy pulse that required a low-energy recovery. The mothballing was a necessity of the system, ensuring that the sartorial armour and the social structures would be reset and ready for the reignition of the machine the following spring. The infinite history of London was a loop, and the exodus was the silent gap between the flickering ribbons of the gaslight. The final synthesis, the entropic end of the gilded machine. The collapse of the Victorian social structure was a phase transition driven by three corrosive forces: technological acceleration, economic dilution, and the biological shock of 1914. The symmetrical world of the 1880s could not survive the high-velocity friction of the new century. The electronic displacement, the death of the gaslight. As we explored in the luminous clouds and the glare, gaslight provided a warm amber diffusion that acted as a sartorial filter, hiding the biological decay of the elite. Electricity was mineral and unforgiving. The visual exposure. Under the harsh spectrum of the incandescent bulb, the sartorial armour looked heavy and dusty. The makeup of the era, designed for the flicker of the flame, appeared as a cracked mask. The atmospheric thinning. Electricity removed the chemical scent of the party. The soot and sulphur that had provided a sensory anchor were gone, leaving a sterile void. The magic of the mineral was electrocuted by the efficiency of the wire. The death of the hansom, the kinetic revolution. The dawn of the hansom, the gondola of London, was replaced by the internal combustion engine. This was a biomechanical shift that destroyed the ritual of the threshold. The motor car was a high-decibel intruder. Unlike the rhythmic gallop of the horse, the car was a continuous mechanical drone. The erosion of the arrival. The grand promenade relied on the predictable speed of the carriage. The car introduced disruptive velocity. Guests no longer arrived in a symmetrical flow, they arrived in bursts of exhaust. The sartorial armor versus the open top. Early automobiles were wind tunnels. The complex geometry of the Victorian hat and the lace chassis of the gown were mechanically compromised by the aerodynamic pressure of 30 miles per hour. The sovereign unfolding was replaced by the scramble for the goggles. The economic dilution, the tax on the mineral. The heavy gold that had anchored the social ledger began to leak. The Industrial Revolution, which had fueled the gilded sanctuary, eventually created a taxation system designed to redistribute the mass. The introduction of death duties, inheritance tax, and income tax acted as a systemic drain. The liquidating of the asset. Families were forced to sell the iron-bound chests of silver and the old master portraits to pay for the maintenance cycle of the house. The shrinking of the engine. The midnight kitchen, the subterranean engine, became too expensive to run. The military hierarchy of servants evaporated as the working millions moved into the factory stratum for higher wages and temporal freedom. The Great Levelling, the biological shock of 1914. The infinite history of the Victorian Party was finally shattered by the First World War. This was the ultimate entropy. The architecture of the invitation was repurposed for biological survival. The ballroom as ward. The high-friction floors were covered with linoleum, and the acoustic horizon shifted from the waltz to the groan of the wounded. The sartorial collapse. The corset chassis and silk armor were replaced by the functional uniform. The hourglass silhouette was digitally deleted by the utility of the khaki. The missing generation. The marital mergers, the chessboard of the ballroom, were halted because the players were in the trenches. The reputational ledger was no longer written in society columns, but in casualty lists. The final stasis, the museum of the party. By the 1920s, the Victorian Party had become a mineralized fossil. The gilded sanctuary was no longer a living system. It was a historical archive. The mothballs, the chemical defense, had done their job too well. The world they were preserving had disappeared. The infinite history of the 1880s was now a curiosity. The subterranean engine of the kitchen was replaced by the electric range, and the acoustic command of the bells was replaced by the telephone. The sovereign unfolding of the elite was replaced by the fragmented energy of the Jazz Age. The acoustic echo. The Victorian Party was a moment of maximum order before the chaos of the modern. It was a gilded cage built of mineral, silk, and gaslight, designed to defy the physics of change. But, like all closed systems, it succumbed to entropy. The infinite history of these nights remains etched in the architecture of London. When you walk through Mayfair today, the heavy gold is gone, the link buoys are shadows, and the hansom is a museum piece. But if you listen closely to the acoustic horizon of the city at 3 a.m., you can still hear the faint vibration of the gilded machine, a symphonic ghost of a world that believed for a moment that the party would never end. That is where the true spirit of how was partying in Victorian London rests. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night.